Hey everyone, Tactics here, and we've got a tank special today. We're going to be going over the most dangerous abilities for all of my beefy brothers and sisters in Season 3. I've also got an interrupt video guide already out as well, which I'll link down below, plus full dungeon guides with raid guides on the way as well. So make sure you do subscribe for all that. Otherwise, let's just dive right into it. Let's not waste time. And we're going to start with the returning Dawnbreaker dungeon, which has several tank changes over the course of the entire dungeon compared to what it did back in Season 1. So off the bat here, the Nightfall Curse Blades, they no longer have a magic effect. They actually have an Enrage and Intensifying Aggression, which stacks up with each hit. Overall, these guys aren't too scary, but if you have any Soothes in your group, you can use it on these guys occasionally if you feel like you're taking too much auto attack damage. Really, the dangerous guy in this dungeon, just like in Season 1, are the Nightfall Commanders and their Tainted Slash Bleed. So you want to make sure that you have some sort of defensive running every single time it goes out. And also, if you have Bleed Cleanses, great time to use it on this. Otherwise, early on, there's just these Sareki Web Mages, and they spam a bolt at you specifically. So spare kicks can go to that, but a lot of kicks are going to be going into the random target bolts in this area. So you're not going to have full interrupts on this ability, so be ready with some defensives. Moving on to the first boss, Speaker Shadow Crown. This was a notorious one in Season 1, and it's had some damage adjustments. So first off, the bolt on you, Shadow Bolt, is much more powerful in Season 3, so interrupting it is significantly more important than it was back in Season 1. To compensate for that, the actual giant take hit in Obsidian Beam, which again doesn't seem like a tank hit, but trust me, this is a tank hit. You need a defensive hit every single time, but it now does less damage than it did back in Season 1. So comparatively, that should be easier to deal with. You still want a defensive rotation on it, and the Shadow Bolt is a little bit more dangerous, so you want to try and keep interrupts on that. Moving down into the city, the main tank mob you're going to be afraid of are the Nightfall Tacticians. These guys just melee really hard. They have a frontal to a point away, and they also have an Enrage and Tactician's Rage, which makes their autos do a ton more damage and also slows them by 70% for that duration. So either use defensives when this is active, use Soothes if you have them, or if you're really down bad, you can kite since they are significantly slower with that buff. The other main tank mob in this area are the Nightfall Shadow Walkers. These guys previously had a magic tank buster that has been entirely removed. Instead, they now have a buff in Shadow Blades, which causes their auto attacks to apply a stacking 1% healing reduction. This is on a short 5-second duration, so it actually is quite easy to drop if you just get lucky with some parries or dodges, or if you overlap enough CCs. And just like the Tacticians, don't be afraid to kite here if needed, because those stacks can get scary if they ramp up. They likely won't if you're only pulling one of these guys at a time. Two of them, though, it can start to get scary. And three, that thing is definitely going to stack up quickly. From there, both the mini-boss in Excretin as well as the second boss, Anubikaj, have the same tank buster in Terrifying Slam. This does a big AoE around you that fears anyone hit and also knocks you back a significant distance. So finding some sort of terrain, like inside the church where you fight Excretin or along the fence posts for Anubikaj, can be very useful in order to prevent that knockback, particularly for those specs that don't have a way to actually mitigate that knockback themselves, like paladins, for example. Other than that, you just want to make sure that you have a defensive up for every single cast of this ability. From there, the only tank buster remaining is on the Nightfall Dark Architect, which is the mob right before Roshanon on the Dawnbreaker deck. And they just have a passive in Dark Fervor, which causes their attacks to deal more shadow damage to you. And be careful, because these guys auto attack very hard, much more dangerous than you would expect. So when you're pulling this mob, pop a defensive, trust me, you will thank me later. From there, we can move to the spider-infested Ara-Kara, where there isn't actually a lot for tanks in this first area. The mini-boss at the end of this area in Atik has the Poison Bolt ability, which is a spam cast bolt on you that also applies a stacking poison. So again, one of those situations where not a lot of interrupts are going to be into this because there's bolters in this area on random players. So having a poison dispel can be quite useful. Going into the first boss, there's a pretty dangerous tank buster in Voracious Bite. Physical hit, so be careful with this. But the real danger actually comes from the debuff, which is a damage amp to all damage taken for 10 seconds. And so when that actually overlaps with other abilities like the AoE damage or even just the boss's autos, that's where you're really in danger. So you want to make sure that you defensive such that it persists through the actual debuff duration if possible. Moving into the second area are the Bloodstained Assistants and their Extraction Strike. This has actually been nerfed since Season 1. In Season 1, it actually used to apply a stacking buff that increased the damage done. That no longer happens, so instead it is just going to deal a basic fizz hit that leeches a bit of damage. Much, much less dangerous this season compared to Season 1, which is nice to see. But at the same time, the reinforced drones at the end of the dungeon are potentially a bit more dangerous. These guys previously had a tank hit that was just like a one-time event, did some damage, applied to stacking slow to you. Now they have a passive, again, similar to those guys we mentioned, the Shadow Walkers and Dawnbreaker, where their auto attacks are going to stack up this debuff on you, and this debuff not only deals damage, but it also slows you and reduces your healing. So that is quite dangerous. The benefit over the previous iteration is that this is a magic debuff, so it can be removed by things like Dwarf Racial, it can be removed by like Mass Dispel, or obviously just your healers regular dispel. So you have some out now. If you weren't previously able to remove the slow and get out of these circles that spawned in this area, that's a little bit easier if your healer times the dispel properly. And of course, snare removals still work on this since it is a slow. So a lot of tanks, it is just easier to deal with this, but the damage intake is going to be pretty high because of how fast this stacks up due to the number of these mobs in the area, right? Again, the Shadow Walker, there's like usually 1 or 2 in a pull. These guys, it's more like 4 to 6 in a pull. So there's a lot more stacking going on here. Your healer's going to be busy trying to spell you on cooldown, but you're still going to have a lot of stacks. So beware of that damage intake. Next up, let's refresh ourselves a little bit on Operation Floodgate. So the soldiers are going to put a stacking debuff similar to that one we actually just mentioned in Blood Infused Strikes, but this one's only a chance to apply, so not on every auto attack. So again, magic dispels, Watcher stacks, use defensive as needed. Dark Fuse Hyenas have Pack Tactic, which makes them do more damage the more hyenas they are in a pull. So try not to pull like 6 of these guys at once. Try to keep it to like 2, maybe 3 if you want to go crazy. For some other beasts in this area, there's obviously the Bombshell Crabs, which have Pinch. The hit itself isn't super scary, it's just a fizz hit, but it does slow you, which can be a little bit scary with some of the other circles and frontal abilities and stuff like that that need to be dodged, so just be aware of that and use freedom effects if you have them. The Crocolists were a mob that was mostly avoided, but some people would actually bring it on to the Demolition Duo boss for a little bit of funnel, and if you are doing that, need to be careful because they also have a healing reduction tank buster that will stack up on you if it's successful, so use defensives and kite if needed to not let that refresh. And then on the Demolition Duo themselves, there is, of course, the Wallop hit. This happens 2 times per boss phase between the sets of charges. So just make sure your defensives are planned accordingly. And be aware of the knock-up because this can happen, and then there might be bombs or circles or other things near you. You want to quickly move out of that while you have control of your character. The next boss, Big Mama, also has a very nasty tank buster in Electro Crush. This has been nerfed going into Season 3, but it is still something you need a good, sturdy defensive cooldown rotation on, so make sure you are ready with that. Otherwise, the only other tank guy in this area are the Dark Fuse Blood Warpers, who will spam cast Blood Bolt into you. A lot of these should hopefully be kicked because there aren't a ton of other important interrupts with these mobs, maybe like a one-off interrupt here and there. So a lot of this should be interrupted, but you still need to be careful, especially just after the boss does his AoE. If that bolt goes off, you are in danger, so watch your health, use defensives as needed. The third boss in Swamp Face also has a tank buster. It's a pattern in this dungeon, and that is in Sludge Claws. Less scary than Electro Crush, still something to be aware of. And if you have any self-healing, it's nice to save it for just after this hit goes off to immediately kind of cleanse that healing absorb that it puts on you. Moving downstairs into the power plant, the Jumpstarter Lieutenant mobs have the Spark Slam ability. This hit itself is relatively low, again, not super scary on its own, but it's the combination of this guy doing the Spark Slam on you, plus this guy pulsing for AoE damage, plus maybe there's a second jump starter in the pull in one of these pulls, right? So it's the combination of all that stuff. So layering your defensives here, kind of staggering them across the entire pull of fighting these guys is important, just to make sure you don't get kind of wombo comboed by all those abilities. Finally, last boss, a Giesel Gigazap Thunder Punch ability. This is both a pretty large initial hit and then a very short but very dangerous dot, unlike Electro Crush, which is much longer. This is really concentrated into just a few seconds, so you want a defensive late in that Thunder Punch cast such that it covers the entire duration of that dot. It also has a pretty significant knockback tied to it, so if you don't have a way to prevent that knockback, then positioning yourself up against the console at the front of the room is super useful because then you don't go anywhere. Moving on, we have the final returning dungeon in Priory of the Sacred Flame, and Guard Captain Suleiman is the first scary tank mob you're going to encounter, and he's also got a knockback tank buster and shield slam. This did get nerfed going into Season 3, a little bit less damage, also became blockable, so shout out to Paladins and Warriors. It's going to be much easier for them to handle this ability, but in terms of how to actually handle the knockback, it happens quite frequently, so pretty much all the specs are going to need something, and also just getting knocked and charging back sometimes moves the pack a bit, so the way to handle this is either to use one of the walls around here, or to position on one of the staircases, because if you get pushed up the staircase, it actually doesn't push you at all. That stair stops you. So very, very useful. Do that, and then that'll keep the pack centered in one spot. Makes it easier to cleave everything down. Now, if you go along the right side, which is maybe looking a little bit more popular, maybe I'm coping, who knows, but let's say you're going up the right side, you got Forge Master Damien and his Seal of Flame ability. This buffs him, and then all his auto attacks, when this happens, deals a hit of magic damage to you, and then also spawns puddles under random players. The key here is, if you're able to avoid that hit with like a parry or a dodge or whatever, or you're able to immune the magic damage with like spell warding or AMS or bubble or something like that, then no puddles spawn. So you can actually abuse that in order to make it so that none of your group needs to actually move. Otherwise, you just need to make sure you have enough space to actually fill in the area with puddles and then move away and not accidentally butt pull one of these packs. Or you can also loosely kite as well, because if he's not successfully meleeing you, he's not spawning any of these puddles. Keep that in mind. When you kill this guy, he spawns Lena Emberlands, which of course has that Divine Judgment tank kit, which puts a magic debuff damage amp on you, so healers will need to dispel you. Previously, people did this on the boss, but if you're going right, this guy's on the boss, makes that first boss a lot easier. So another benefit, just saying. Otherwise, you've got Captain Dalecry, that first boss we were mentioning, and his Pierce Armor Bleed. This is another tank debuff from Season 2 that is getting nerfed in Season 3, with the duration getting heavily reduced down to 7 seconds now on that bleed. Still something you will want a CD rotation on, and Bleed Cleanse is obviously still super valuable in this dungeon, but just a little bit easier to handle. Moving into the next trash area, the most dangerous guys for you are by far the Zealous Templars. They have a couple buffs to worry about. First, they have a magic buff in Templar's Wrath, which can be purged if you have it as a flat damage increase. Second, they have a passive increase, which cannot be removed in any way, in Seal of Light's Fury, which is an attack speed increase and also adds magic damage to their attacks. So that's really when they have the combo of those abilities when you're in danger. Plus that combined with the AoE damage going out in this area is what you're scared of. So you want to make sure, again, kind of like with those jump starters that we talked about in Floodgate, stagger your defensives here, kind of extend them for as long as you can, chain them just to deal with all that incoming damage, because it's relatively spread out on these pulls. Other than that, it's just both the Brawn Pike. So first off, the second boss, Baron Brawn Pike, will be buffing himself with Vindictive Wrath, which is just a physical damage increase when it happens. So that's going to be dealing a lot of extra damage to you, especially if you're doing a lot of the soaks as the tank player. And then you move upstairs and you fight Sir Brawn Pike, and he's got the Blazing Strike ability. Pretty dangerous hit, 10-second dot, again combined with pulsing AoE damage. So a defensive that late in the cast that will last for as long as the dot as possible, staggered throughout the pull in order for you to also live all that extra damage going out. From there, let's talk the brand new dungeon, Ecodome Aldani, where there are a couple of buffs to be aware of early on. So the Ravaging Scavenger in the first area will enrage at 50% health with Hungering Rage, so that's an attack speed increase, so be aware of that. You might need to backload your defensives. Similarly, the Wastelander Phase Blade has the Alacrity magic buff, so that is going to be purgeable as opposed to soothable, and that is again just an attack speed increase. So you want to watch out if you got a bunch of these guys and they all gain that at the same time. In terms of big individual hits, the scariest one I think is on Overcharged Sentinels and their Arcane Slash. This is a frontal that follows you, so make sure you point it away from your group and you pop a defensive every single time. Again, late in the cast, because this also has an Arcane Dot attached to it. That's probably the scariest tank buster, though a close second is Tabat and Awaj, which has the Rift Claws bleed effect in the first phase. This one's a bit odd, as the actual initial hit, which is probably the scariest part of the tank buster, is arcane, and then the dot that it leaves on you is a bleed. So you can use bleed removals on that second part, but really what you want to make sure you have the defensive for is the initial hit, so make sure you do that. Otherwise, there's waste creepers in the last area of the dungeon. They have a tank targeted shadow hit in Gloom Bite, which also puts a healing absorb on you. So if you are pulling these guys, make sure you have a defensive up for each of those casts. Then we have the Mega Dungeon, where Tazavesh Streets there's a lot of abilities in this dungeon. So let's just go. So right off the top, you've got the mini boss you face initially, as well as any of the armored overseers in this area, and they've got the proxy strike hit. This is just magic damage to you. Be aware of that. Didn't necessarily need to always defensive this, especially if there's a lot of these mobs is just going to overlap a bit. So just be aware if there's a few of them, basically, and if it overlaps with anything, specifically the custom security and their hard light baton. This is a magic buff that makes their melees do additional arcane damage. So really the big value defensive in this area is to defensive when this hard light baton buff goes up, and also have it overlap, hopefully, with some of the proxy strike hits. Obviously, though, if you have a purge, you can just deal with this hard light baton, so you don't actually need to worry about defensiving it. Otherwise, in this dungeon, there's quite a few tank-specific bolts. So you've got support officers in this first area, as well as cartel wise guys if you go right after the first boss. And your interrupt capacity is going to be different depending on where you're on the dungeon. For example, early on, there's some other stuff you want to interrupt as well, so more of those may go off compared to later on when there's really nothing else happening. Zofex, the first boss, also has some tank damage in the form of a buff in fully armed. Basically, all this guy does is swing on you the entire fight, and he swings quite hard. Harder with this buff as it's a 25% physical damage increase. So while this happens, until the next time the boss shoots out those whirlwind swords in armed security, he's going to be dealing quite a bit more damage to you. So that's when you want to make sure you have defensive coverage. Otherwise, going right after the first boss, besides those bolters, also has Cartel Skulkers, and they have the Quick Blade attack, which is a line attack through the tank, which applies a bleed to any one hit. If these guys do this in quick succession, and there's a lot of them in the pack because they are stealth and could accidentally be added, it's quite dangerous. It's a long bleed. That bleed kind of hurts, so bleed cleanses if you are going right specifically. Very powerful, though maybe you just want to go left. That is an option as well. Also in this right area are the cartel muscles, and these guys actually have two things to be aware of. First off, they have a buff and Chronolite Enhancer, which is an enrage that increases their damage but also slows them, very similar to that mob from the Dawnbreaker. And then second, they also have a straight up tank buster in Hyperlight Backhand, so a little bit scarier than those Dawnbreaker mobs in my opinion. This deals a big hit and then also knocks you back, so don't get knocked into any ground effects in this area or other packs in this area. And if you need to, kite this mob. Now, if you instead had opted to go left instead of right after the first boss, it's just the first mini boss you face in Tracker Zokors, which has a tank buster, and that is a lockdown. This is a tank targeted magic dot and root, so if you have snare breaks, you can remove it. Otherwise, there's no other dispels in this area, so your healer can just dispel this off of you, making him much safer, at least in terms of tank damage intake. If you move back though towards Miza's Oasis, there's the Bizarre Overseer that patrols in this area, and he's got the Pierce ability, which is a tank targeted physical hit that also increases your damage taken by 20%. So be careful when you have that debuff. Otherwise, on the boss fight itself, there's the Security Slam ability from both the Oasis security as well as Zogron, the boss himself, which is just a physical hit on the tank. Honestly, it's not too scary individually, but when there's two securities hitting you at the same time, that's when you're a little bit scared, so press the defensive every cast regardless. In the post room, we've got the post workers and their letter opener cast. Yet another bleed, so as you can see, there's a lot of bleeds this season, specifically on tanks. Being a dwarf, never been better. Maybe have an evoker in your group, never been better. Who knows? But bleed cleanses as needed, defensives as needed, be aware of that. Kite if you really need to not have a stack refresh or something like that, UCCs, whatever you need to do. In the center area of the dungeon, you've got the Commerce Enforcers as well as the mini-boss commander Zofar, and they've got the Power Kick ability, which just launches you on top of doing a physical hit. So again, be careful not to get hit into other packs, and be careful with the force field gate things in this area, because if you ever pass through it, whether it's from this kick or not, it will stun you, and that is very bad as a tank, so make sure you avoid that from happening. Otherwise, the only tank buster remaining is on the Menagerie boss, Achillite, the second boss of the Menagerie, has Flagellation Protocol, which is a physical channel into you. Honestly, not too scary, and really the only thing on this fight for you to worry about, so just Prince Defensive for every cast of that. Otherwise, we can move on to the second half of the Mega Dungeon in Gambit, where the number of tank busters is way, way, way down. So in the first area, you've got just the Mercbrine Shell Crushers and their Shell Cracker hit. It's a relatively low fizz hit and a knockback, but the main thing is there's a lot of circles in this area that you need to avoid, so just make sure you don't get knocked into those circles. Otherwise, there's nothing until the first boss, and Hilbrand, who has the Shearing Swings ability, which is 2 physical hits to you over the duration of the channel, so just make sure you always have a defensive up. Moving beyond this, there's the Burly Deckhands, who will enrage themselves with Super Saison. That makes them do a lot more damage to you because all they do is swing on you. So if you have Stews, use them. Otherwise, don't be afraid to use CCs, slow these mobs, and then kite them a bit till that duration ends. Hourglass Tide Sages are also in this area, and they just have a Tank Bolt and Brackish Bolt. So all of your kicks are going to be going into that because there is just nothing else to interrupt. So it shouldn't be too bad. Otherwise, the only tank-related ability is in the last boss area, the Focus Ritualist, and their Hyperlight Bolt ability. Now, this one is going to go off significantly more because there are other important interrupts in this area on these mobs even. So expect to take a bit more damage from this, but you're not getting really hit by those scary burly deckhands in this area. So Focus Ritualist is all you have to worry about. Finally, we can finish off in Halls of Atonement, which has a bunch of debuffs to be aware of off the top. So the Depraved Darkblade, previously had a frontal, that's gone, don't worry about that. They now have a passive though, and like some of the other passives we mentioned, it stacks up a debuff on you. This one is a magic debuff that increases all of your damage taken by 2%. So you would think, I'm just going to get my healer to spell me. Well, there's a problem here because there are multiple other magic debuffs going out in this area. So a lot of the time, your healer may be busy. So you need to watch out your stacks of this ability, and you need to be ready to defensive or even to single target stun or just stun the other dark blades in this pack if there are multiple and get away from them in order to drop your stacks if you need to. Again, another situation where Dwarf is really valuable. The other situation where Dwarf may be valuable are the Vicious Gargants. Now, these guys have had some changes over the course of the PTR. It's currently unclear if they're going to have a bleed. There was like PTR notes where they nerfed their bleed effect and then they just disappeared without any notice whatsoever. So they might not have any Tank Buster, but if they do have a Tank Buster, it is Serrated Claws, which is a passive that causes their abilities to stack up a bleed on you. And so if that's here, that's one more bleed in the pool and one more thing that you may want to save your Dwarf for. Maybe you get some big value. You can Dwarf both the Dark Blade ability and the Gargant Bleed. That would be super value, but just be aware. This guy may get their bleed back at some point. It's currently not on the PTR, but there's been no announcement as to why. So just something to note. Higher bleed stacks, very scary, especially because Vicious Gargants often come in pairs. Other than that, the only tank buster before the first boss are these Stoneborn Slashers. These guys move in and out of being attackable and aggroable, and then not attackable and not aggroable, so you can walk right by them. If you do aggro them, two things. One is the Tank Hit and Stonefist, which is also a knockback. Don't get knocked in the other packs. This one is a bit more dangerous than the Shell Crusher, though, for example, so you may actually need defensives for this. Other thing is a tank-targeted frontal, so point this guy away from your group. That brings us to Halkias, the first boss, and he's just got the Crumbling Slam ability, which does an AoE around you as the tank, hits you, and then drops a puddle on the ground. So make sure that you are not cleaving any of your allies, and if possible, to conserve space on this boss, you can actually pop your defensive a little bit early, and then step onto some existing puddles on the ground just to conserve space. Beyond Halkias is one of the more dangerous tank busters in the dungeon in Mortal Strike. This, as expected, hits you and then puts a Mortal Strike ability, 35% reduced healing received. So pretty hefty one there. If you're a tank spec that heavily relies on self-healing like Blood Decay and Vengeance, this is going to be much scarier than some of those other previously mentioned tank busters. Other than that, you move up to the second boss in Echelon, and the ads he spawns on this fight have the Villainous Bolt ability, which is just a tank-targeted bolt. Now, the important thing is, there is a few seconds delay before they start casting, and you need to make sure you get aggro on these as quickly as possible. Otherwise, this tank bolt is going to go into other players who just have aggro, like your healer maybe, which would be very, very bad. Don't be afraid to use CCs here to force the mobs to retarget if they ever start targeting on someone that isn't you, or interrupts, of course, also work. Moving forward, we have to go all the way to the third boss before we get another tank ability in High Adjudicator Elise, and this is just a specifically tank targeted bolt in Anima Bolt. This is just a shadow hit, nothing else to do here. Keep an interrupt rotation on this. Beyond High Adjudicator Elise is the mini boss Inquisitor Cigar. He's got a tank targeted bolt in Wicked Bolt. Interpretation on that. Notably, the Wicked Bolts at the start of the dungeon used to be tank targeted. They are now random target, at least on the PTR. Maybe that will change, but just want to note that here. If it doesn't change, you won't need to worry about them. They're going to be hitting random people, but if they move it back to being tank targeted, that's all of a sudden something dangerous again at the start of the dungeon. Moving on to the final boss, Lord Chamberlain, he's got the Stigma of Pride ability, and this is actually a really nasty dot. It lasts for 18 seconds, ticks every 3 seconds, and then every tick, the damage it deals is increased by 30%. So you actually don't really care for defensiving this early on. You just want to make sure that your defensive press covers as many of the late hits as possible, and definitely covers that last hit. So if you have an 8-second defensive, you cast it when there's 8 seconds left on this dot, and you're good. As long as you're covering those last few ticks, that's what you really want to do. But there we have it, guys. Hopefully this helps you survive the start of Season 3, and if it does, be sure to leave a like and subscribe for more guide content, including route walkthroughs, a tank-specific raid guide, and much more. As always, I need to shout out my amazing Patreons for their continued support. I appreciate you guys so much, and I'll see everyone in the next video.